Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Bava, Kamma. We are up to Perek Hey Mishnah Hey. Today's Mishnayot should be Leilun Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Ranbai, Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov, Chana ben Miriam, Sason ben Raya, and Yoshua ben Shifra, Menuchatam beGan Eden, Amen. And Avdi ben Chaim lechaim v'derefua shelemav Daniel Shalom ben Rosa, betoch Shah Chulei Israel. From here until the end of the chapter, the Mishnah discusses the category of damage called bor, a pit, which includes obstacles that a person makes in a public space. If someone digs a pit in his private domain and opens it to the public domain, for example, he digs a pit in the public domain and the angle so that the floor of the pit is in his own property. Since the pit opens into the public domain, an animal walking in the public domain could fall into it. Or he digs a pit in the public domain and opens it to his private domain. For example, he digs in his own property at an angle so that the floor of the pit is under the public domain. Now the Mishnah refers to a case where the digger gave up his ownership of the area around the opening of the pit, marking it part of the public domain where people and animals may walk. If he had kept that area as part of his private property and not declared it ownerless, he would not be obligated to pay for damage caused by the pit, because he could say to the victim, "What were you doing on my property?" So we're referring to a case where he gave up his ownership of the area around the opening of the pit. Or he digs a pit in his private domain and opens it to another private domain that he owns. In this case too, he gave up his ownership of the area around the pit's opening, thereby making it part of the public domain. Now the Mishnah could have said that the floor of the pit and its opening were in the same private domain. However, in keeping with the styles of the preceding cases, it describes the pit's opening and floor as being in two different domains. Chayav, in all of these cases, he is obligated to pay for damages caused by the pit. In summary, it makes no difference where one digs a pit, as long as its opening is accessible to the public. The digger is liable for any damage it causes. Now, in the preceding cases, the damager owned either the pit or its opening. The Mishnah now cites a case where the damager owns neither. If someone digs a pit in the public domain, and an ox or a donkey or any other animal fell into it and died. Now, the Mishnah speaks of an ox or donkey because these are the animals mentioned in the verse in Sefer Shemot, chapter 21, verse 33, about a pit that causes damage. But again, it would apply to any other animal. If it fell into it and died, Chayav is obligated to pay for it. Even though the entire pit, the floor and its opening, is in the public domain and no part of it belongs to the one who dug it, he is responsible for the damage that it causes. The Gemara on page 49b derives this law from a verse. Now the Mishnah lists various types of pits for which one is liable if he digs or uncovers them. Whether one digs a typical round pit, a ditch, which is a long and narrow pit, a vault, which is a square pit covered with the roof in which there is an opening, square pits, which is square pits that are uncovered, or wedge-like pits, pits that are wide on top and narrow at the bottom, Chayav, he is obligated to pay for the damage that they cause. If so, why is only a standard pit mentioned in the Torah in Shemot chapter 21, verses 33 and 34? So the Mishnah says this is to teach the following. Just as a standard pit is able to cause death, because a standard pit is 10 tvachim deep, which is deep enough to kill an animal that falls into it, so too, any other type of pit must be able to cause death, meaning it must be at least 10 tvachim deep. If any of these pits were less than 10 tvachim deep, and an ox or donkey fell into it and died, patur, the digger is not obligated to pay, because it is completely unexpected that such a shallow pit will cause an animal's death, and so the digger cannot be blamed. However, if an animal was merely injured by falling into it, a pit less than 10 tvachim deep, chayav, the digger is obligated to pay, because even shallow pits can cause injury. And that is then a Mishnah Hey. Now, the Torah states that not only digging a pit, but merely uncovering a pit makes one obligated for any damage it causes, is the book of Shemot, chapter 21, verse 33. The Mishnah Vav discusses these laws regarding a pit that is owned by two people. Normally, both owners would be obligated to pay for any damage caused by their pit, but in the following cases, only one is obligated. If there is a pit that belongs to two partners, for example, two people owned the courtyard in which there was a pit, they gave up their ownership of the courtyard but kept the pit. Avar alav harishon v'lo chisau. When the first one passed by it, uncovered it to draw water, for example, and did not cover it again. V'ashini lo chisau. And before he left, the second one passed by, and the first one gave the cover to the second, but the second one too did not cover it. Ashini chayav. Only the second one is obligated to pay for any damage caused later by the pit. The second one must pay because he should have covered the pit. The first partner, though, does not have to pay because he fulfilled his responsibility by giving the cover to the second one. By giving the cover to the second partner, it is as though the first partner asked him to watch the pit. Therefore, if any accident happens, it is entirely the second one's fault. However, if both partners pass by their uncovered pit and left it uncovered, they are equally liable for the damage. Another case regarding a pit that belongs to two people. Kisao Rishon, if the first one covered it properly, Ubashini Umtsao Megule, and the second one came sometime afterward and found it uncovered because, for example, the cover had become wormy and broke. Now, the case cannot be that a person uncovered it because that person would become entirely responsible for the pit, as the Gemara in 49b derives from a verse in Shemot, chapter 21, verse 33. So, the case that we're referring to is the cover had become wormy and broke. When the second one did not cover it, Sheni Chayav, the second one is obligated to pay for any damage later caused by the pit, since he should have covered it, but did not do so. The first part, however, does not have to pay because he covered it properly, although later became wormy. That was an unlikely accident, which he was not expected to foresee. Once he covered the pit properly, he's not required to constantly go back and check whether the cover is still strong and has not become wormy. If, however, the first partner did find out that the cover was weak, and he had enough time to make a new one or hire someone to make a new one and cover the pit with it, both are obligated to pay for damage caused by the pit, since both knew that it was not covered properly and failed to fix it. The Mishnah now teaches some general laws of a pit, which apply regardless of how many people own it. If the owner of a pit covered it properly, and nevertheless an ox or donkey fell into it and died, because, for example, the cover had become wormy in the meantime, Patur is not obligated to pay damages since he covered it properly and was not expected to foresee that it would become wormy. But if he did not cover the pit properly and an ox or a donkey fell into it and died, Chayav is obligated to pay. Now this ruling is obvious. The Gemara on page 52b suggests that it is included only to round out the section of the Mishnah. Since the Tana began the section with he covered it properly, he ends it with the case of he did not cover it properly, even though that case is obvious. The Mishnah considers the law where an animal fell into a pit, not because it stepped into the pit's airspace, but because a worker was digging inside a pit and the noise of the digging startled the animal, causing it to fall. If it was near a pit and fell forward into the pit because it was startled by the noise of the digging, Chayav, the owner of the pit, is obligated to pay for the damage. Even though it was the noise rather than the pit that caused the animal to fall, the owner of the pit is liable because the damage occurred in his pit. But if the animal fell backward onto the ground outside the pit because it was startled by the noise of the digging, Patur, the owner of the pit, is not obligated to pay, because in this case the damage happened outside the pit. In either case, the worker who made the noise does not have to pay because he caused the damage only indirectly. The Mishnah discusses what type of damage the owner of a pit is obligated to pay for. If an ox fell into it together with its gear, such as its yoke and plow, and the ox was injured and the yoke or plow broke, or a donkey fell into it together with its gear, such as the blanket under its saddle or a bunch of its clothes it was carrying, and the donkey was injured and the items were torn, the owner of the pit is obligated to pay for the damage to the animal, but he is not obligated to pay for the damage to the gear. This is because the Torah states in the book of Shemot, chapter 21, verses 33 and 34, if a man uncovers a pit or digs a pit and an ox or a donkey falls there, the owner of the pit shall pay. By mentioning only animals, the verse implies that he must pay only for damage to animals and not for damage to their gear or any other objects they are carrying. Now the Mishnah defines the type of animal for whose injury or death the owner of the pit must pay. If an ox that is deaf, foolish, or young, meaning it has not yet been trained to pull a plow. Before an ox has been trained to pull a plow, it runs about wildly and does not avoid obstacles. So again, if an ox that is deaf, foolish, or young, meaning it has not been trained to pull a plow, fell into a pit and was injured or died, Chayav, the owner of the pit is obligated to pay because such animals do not take care to avoid pits. The same law applies to an animal walking at night or a blind one even during the day. but he does not have to pay for damage done to a normal animal. Since a normal animal looks where it is going and tries to keep away from pits, its falling into a pit is an unexpected occurrence for which the owner of the pit is not responsible. Now, this ruling applies only where the pit is open, in which case a normal ox would see the pit and walk around it. If, however, it was covered, but the cover is not strong enough to prevent an ox from falling in, an ox cannot be expected to see the danger. Therefore, if an ox stepped on the cover and fell into the pit, the owner of the pit must pay damages. Now, only animals are expected to avoid obstacles when they are walking. People are less likely to avoid obstacles because they're often busy with their thoughts and do not pay attention to where they are going. Therefore, if any person, even one who is mature and sane, falls into a pit and is injured, the owner of the pit cannot claim that this was an unexpected accident. Now, the verse quoted earlier, which mentions only animals, it says an ox or a donkey falls there, excludes not just objects, but also people. The Torah therefore teaches that even if a person falls into a pit and dies, the owner of the pit is exempt from payment, and the Mishnah elaborates upon this law. Ben or bat, even if a young boy or girl, Eved or Amar, a male Canaanite slave or a female Canaanite slave fell into a pit and died, patur, the owner of the pit is not obligated to pay because the verse implies that he must pay only for the death of animals and not for the death of any people, regardless of their age or status. Although this law applies to all people, the Mishnah mentions only children and Canaanite slaves. It mentions children in order to teach that although children cannot be expected to avoid obstacles and therefore the blame for their death lies with the owner of the pit, the Torah exempts him from payment, and it mentions Canaanite slaves in order to teach that although they are owned by others, the law exempting the owner from payment for the death of people applies to Canaanite slaves as well, since they too are people. Now, the owner of a pit is exempt only where the victim died. If the victim was merely injured, the owner must pay. This is because the verse that mentions an ox and a donkey from which it is derived that no payment is required for people and objects speaks of an ox or a donkey that died. Again, in Book of Shemot, chapter 21, verses 33 and 34. Therefore, when this verse excludes people, it refers only to people who died and not to those who were injured. As far as objects are concerned, the owner of the pit is exempt even if they just broke, because the breaking of an object is equivalent to its death. And that is the Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.